Okay, if you take the seat, we can start this panel session, which is dedicated to a topic that has been already raised in previous discussions, the use of open data, and particularly public sector open data for policy making. So we have two eminent members of the scientific community here and one equally eminent member connected online to discuss this with all of you. So Jon Crowcroft, who is Marconi Professor of Communication Systems at University of Cambridge and Alan Turing Institute. He's connected from home or from the university. He could not make it due to some traffic disruption. And then we have here Francesco, who you know already very well, and Barbara Ubaldi, who many of you know. She's from the OECD, and she heads the Open and Innovative Government division at the OECD. The question for all of us in this panel is related to the efforts made in the recent decade, I would say, to make more data available from the public sector to different users, particularly with the assumption that the availability of data and the availability of good data could make it possible to use this data for policy making. So the question that I will ask the panelists is to what extent they feel that this is happening, and how to overcome, if there are, challenges in the actual use of data, and particularly open data, for the policy purposes and the decision making. We touched on this point already in the previous discussions this morning, where concepts like data, information, and knowledge were put in a sequence, and the terms should not be, let's say, given the same meaning, and each of it requires a transformation and a processing behind that. Let me just say that from the standpoint of the set of rules, legal rules, organizational rules, and technical rules, in Europe, there's been a lot of work in terms of defining within the concept of the European data strategy the legal framework, in particular advancing the legal framework, the Open Data Directive that promotes the use of open data and the reuse of public sector information, identifies, for example, high-value data sets. This is in the title of this session. So these are public data of particular importance. But also the Data Governance Act, which was recently approved, has further measures to promote a technical but also rule level the reuse of public sector information for public purposes. And as many of you know, there is an initiative being currently discussed in Council and Parliament of Data Act that completes the legal framework of this new European data ecosystem, and also, among other things, defines the concept of data spaces based on interoperability and reuse of data. So in that framework, the key question is, with all these rules, all the technical work advancing, a large amount of data now being available for policy making, is open data and high-value data set, are these data sets being used? Is the value proposition being met in that respect? And as I said, if not, what are the key challenges ahead? We'll have two quick rounds of discussions with the panelists, and then I hope to have also some questions from the floor, and to have a bit of a discussion with all of you. We'll start with Jon, who is connected remotely. Jon, I hope you can hear us well.
I hear you fine. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Okay. So my experience is dominated by the UK setting, but I can say that in answer to your question, there is a massive increase in the use of data in policy, but it's very, very varied across different sectors in the state sector and public matters. So in areas where, you know, we've heard earlier about digital twins, for example, typically in built infrastructure and utilities and so on, and your transportation, energy systems, so on. It's excellent. In areas where there are privacy concerns, it's still good, which is very interesting. So certainly I can talk about Health Data Research UK using health records with extreme care and attention to ethics, legal and policy concerns about privacy, but also making enormous strides in using the data very effectively. Similarly in finance and economics, we're seeing a big improvements. But there are other sectors where it's incredibly poor, in particular, for example, in law. So in justice systems and other sectors. And this may reflect something about the training of people in the public sector in the UK in those areas. So I have to emphasize that. I have a very narrow view of that. But it is quite good. The last thing I'll just briefly mention in this introductory statement is, of course, explainability, sustainability, as well as privacy, but actually explainability is poorly paid attention to, and it's a very subtle business because you have to think who you're explaining things to. Even the simplest statistics used for actuarial data, statistics for insurance, are probably beyond the training skill set of a large fraction of the population, which means typically you have to go via some intermediary, as you do with healthcare. You don't typically go and read all the papers about what a diagnosis means. You have a doctor who acts as an intermediary to explain things for you. And I think that's sort of understood in the explainable AI world, but it's not being used widely enough and transparently enough. So that would be my main comment here. But there are certainly some areas where data could be very, very useful, but it's very heavily underused in my view.
Thanks a lot, John. We'll come back to you. And now, Barbara, please.
So hi, everyone. Hi, John. I think we have been looking into the great potential of open data reuse for value creation from a socioeconomic and public governance perspective in terms of accountability and transparency for quite some time. And if we look at the lenses of how or what the kind of activities that the reuse of open data can promote from this perspective, from a policymaking perspective, I think we've been all seeing to what extent the reuse of open data can help understand, for example, trends in terms of use across different groups of citizens when it comes to public services and policy goals or objectives. It really helps also co-design and co-delivering services and solutions with partners in the whole ecosystem. I think if we think about examples in France and Japan on how during the pandemic, data released by governments as open data have been reused to produce solutions that made it easier for people to understand or see where they could find masks or where they could find a vaccination. I think there are great examples. And third, by releasing open data, innovative ways of monitoring the impact of policies can be achieved, also bringing on board the external stakeholders. Now, has this been achieved? Not fully. And I think the complexity in many cases is around the fact that data is available, but coming to the main topic of this panel, not always the data more valuable for the users is made available as open data. So in many cases, we still see that there's a top-down decision that comes from government, releasing data that the government thinks are useful, but without a great connection with the whole ecosystem. Second, in terms of accessibility, and I'm not only talking about the technical accessibility. I think by now all people in the open data field in governments think and know that a PDF is not open data, but accessibility is also making sure that the skills are available among different groups of users to actually access the data and do something with that, or I'm thinking about visualization tools. So still the accessibility is not democratic in terms of not targeting all potential users. And third is the reuse. I think we all can agree that without the reuse of the open data, the value cannot be achieved. So it's not because you increase the number of data sets that necessarily the value is created. And I think that the focus on engaging with the stakeholders, the users, understanding the demand is not as sophisticated and mature yet as it could be. So I think these are some of the limitations or the restrictions or barriers for achieving even further value through the use of open data.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. And now to Francesco.
Yes, thanks a lot. So first of all, I'd like to add another dimension apart from data, information, knowledge, which is wisdom. So the fact that we need to provide policymakers, especially the means in order to turn knowledge into wisdom. And in that regard, we need to provide data, of course, but we need to provide metadata, and we need to provide the decision support system that can help, for instance, policymakers to use open data and to turn this open data into what can be used for policy making. So this is a point. From the point of view of to what extent data have been opened, for sure, data related to satellite, for instance, and geoinformation has been opened a lot, and this it's a lot reused by businesses in order to develop their own services. There are several companies in Europe that now has a business model. They use open data and they turn this open data into services, and I collaborate with many of them. There are some other kind of data like statistics on companies, which would be very, very important, which are very important, you know, in order to do, for instance, data market studies in order to know which are your competitors. And those data are somehow still closed, or basically they are available only with payment, with payment of high fees. So I think that, yes, the data are opening day by day. We see more databases that are available, but it's important also to create the condition for their reuse, as we said. So metadata, it's of course very important. It's important to give proof and evidence of the impact of the data reuse. And this is a work that we have been carried out for a while, and it's important to give the tools to reuse this data and to turn this data into wisdom.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for this first round. So we learned that it's not just about data, but data are a key ingredient to enable decision making. You know, I'm a statistician. I produce data of quality for a living. And what we learned in the official statistics domain is that the power of data is in the integration of the different data. Data, isolated data sources do not really carry the information. So the notion about the data spaces, for example, which are embedded in the Data Governance Act regulation, promotes the use of interoperable data spaces, which means that there is an environment of rules and technical standards that support interoperability and support data integration. So I wonder whether if we look at the enablers and the conditions under which open data can be further used for policy purposes, whether you can identify what would be the top priorities. You have already mentioned a few elements that are important conditions for data to be transformed into instruments for policy decisions. But I would be curious if you could identify the ones that matter most in your view. And I go back to Jon first.
Yes, this is the most challenging thing. I'm going to go back to this example I mentioned. In the last 2 years, we had a program in the UK to federate data between the health data research institutes. So we have a number of large establishments that have patient record data, which with consent, so it's a public health service, and the health researchers want to learn models over all the data. It's not in the sense of fully open data. It's not publishable because of the privacy concerns, but models based on it are publishable and extremely reusable and of very high value. So the project or the program of work spent most of its time dealing with aligning the policy and legal and ethical understanding between the different local institutes, some of which are quite big. They represent a city like London or Birmingham or Glasgow, many millions. And once those were aligned, then the work of what's called data wrangling, of just aligning mismatches in formats and metadata, was relatively straightforward. In a single sector. We weren't combining healthcare data with transport data. As soon as you go across domains, the challenges of aligning understanding of what the columns mean is much more subtle, but it's still relatively well understood. And as mentioned, there are many companies that do this, and many products out there, and many researchers and practitioners who know how to do that. So data wrangling used to be regarded as sort of 80% of the work, but actually I think making sure that you have paid attention to the privacy law, for example, what can be inferred when you combine data across multiple sources, and mitigating that correctly, and understanding the gain versus risk and so on. That's a real problem. So the second thing I'd say is sustainability. There's a temptation to throw a sort of kitchen sink toolkit like GPT-3, you know, a foundation model, large language model at the data out of laziness. Luckily, in the medical side, most people have got very good statistical understanding. That's not typically a problem. But in other sectors, the kind of pixie dust or magic of some of the newer tools seems attractive, but it's very high risk. It's certainly not sustainable. It will cost vast amounts of cloud compute resource. And it doesn't have very much in the way of explainability. So it doesn't meet two of the basic requirements, as far as I'm concerned, for anything public sector should be playing with. And worse still, by not doing that, not paying attention to explainability and sustainability, you end up with another problem, which I think is something that there's a tendency in some cultures to think about reuse of data to monetize the data. So you start with open data, but then you think, oh, well, we've labeled the data, we have the metadata, now we have a model, and maybe we can sell that. But there's a terrible, terrible tendency to massively undervalue what's going on there. So classically in supervised learning, you actually have put in a huge amount of value in labeling the data. And again, in finance, economics, or healthcare, the labeling is done by extremely well-trained experts like surgeons or financial experts. And that even with, dare I say, but you know, social care data, very important area, or just the indexes of poverty, the experts that label that data, that's worth far more than the code that implemented a GAN or a neural net or a Bayesian inferencing model, which is typically open source and worth nothing. And yet people think that it's okay to partner with a large organization who then make a large profit out of that. Whereas actually in the sort of data space world, or in any of the terms you're used to using in that space, I think that the originator of the first model should have the vast majority of the value proposition in any trade that's done with that, because they put in all the work, and it was not just sourcing the data and wrangling it or dealing with all the problems of getting it through all the agreements and so on, making sure it was done, the models were acquired sustainably. But actually, all of that work put together represents the vast value. And so I would be cautious about a typical tendency in some parts of the world to rush into public-private partnerships to do the next stage without making sure that the actual commercial agreements about where the value lay are done properly. So that's my main points. As we're dealing with privacy very well where it matters. There's a lot of data where it's not much of a challenge. That's good. Data wrangling is becoming less of the problem. Sustainability can be an issue if one's lazy, but actually for many cases it's not the biggest problem. The explainability for some of the more straightforward models, often one's just doing regression models, the data, you know, statisticians amongst the audience will know that's great. It's extremely well understood and yields a lot of value. But remembering that, you know, this data is of high value, and giving it away or virtually giving it away is not a good plan as far as I'm concerned. If we want sustainability, the EU, for example, should be selling our models to the US or China or wherever for very large amounts of money, maybe in exchange for, you know, free cloud compute for the next 100 years. I'm joking there, but you see my point. You know, that is the sort of value proposition we should be making here. I don't want to sound too commercial minded. I'm being the opposite. I'm trying to say the state, you know, the open data comes from the areas we're talking about, and we should not be, you know, making that available for, you know, a pittance. That's just not the right plan. And just all those reasons I've given about the technical work that goes in, that's where the value came from. We should realize that. If it's not just being shared among states, of course, that's an easier matter where we just have agreements. That's just part of, you know, a trade agreement. That's absolutely great, and that's a really good use where we've already done this with healthcare and between some states. As was mentioned before, actually, pandemic modeling was shared globally, and that was extremely high value and was not monetized by the state health sector doing that work. So that was really good example of good practice for that kind of problem. Enough from me.
Thanks a lot, John. And you touch on a very sensitive point on intercontinental data flows, which is currently being discussed and possibly advanced after the decision by the US president to put into an order some conditions for ensuring an equality of treatment in terms of the data protection between the two systems, the European and the American system. So that's definitely a need for that. Barbara.
If we look at the challenges, I think, first of all, if we look at the access and sharing of the data available, it's something that still presents limitations to what actually could be the reality. And when I talk about access and sharing, I'm really thinking, going back to the idea of integration of data sets that you were talking about. And we talk so much now about public interest, so that the data sets that held by the scientific community, the public sector or the private sector should be made available as open data, because if integrated, if interoperable, if merged, can actually enable to produce value for the society and for the community from different perspectives. And in that sense, I think there's a big still challenge around incentives to actually open up data, and incentives to make the effort to make this sustainable, because I still think that sustainability remains an issue. I work with governments, so that's the community with which I work. And in many cases, open data is the topic in the agenda because it's trendy, because it's cool, because other governments are doing it. And then there are elections, and that is no longer a priority. And therefore, there's no longer support from the new government in continuing the efforts. And open data, like one of the previous interveners said, is not for free. There's a cost, even simply the HR that needs to work on the data to make sure that the data remains available as open data, it has a cost. So I think incentives also to create collaborations between the private and the public when it makes sense. For example, I've been recently in a meeting in which there were some private sector actors who were complaining because of the lack of sustainability. The data was no longer available as they needed to be able to keep producing the products that they were producing, utilizing the data made available as open data. And they would have been happy to actually contribute, even financially, to make sure that the government kept making the data available, but the framework was not in place. And here I come to the second point, which is the legal and regulatory framework is important. It's important also when we are talking about government data being made available as open data, to make sure that the context protects rights and protects concerns around privacy and security, but also that doesn't limit the efforts to open up data. So if there's a collaboration that can be created with the private sector or the academia, why not trying to make it happen within the safeguards that need to be maintained? So I think having in place the legal and regulatory framework is still a challenge for many governments and has not been prioritized. Third, I think, is around the whole idea of trust, meaning the more we talk about making possible for different data sets to be integrated for reuse, we forget a little bit the fact that still in many cases, the ethical use of this data and also the release of this data is not the priority for all. So I think creating a context in which there's a trustworthy environment in which the one who actually has to use the data trusts the data source, but also we trust the reuse of the data, I think it's important. And that brings me to the next challenge, I think, that is in terms of cultural change, because I still think that in terms of cultural change, especially within the public sector, there's work that needs to be done. So there are the converted, there are the institutions that have been doing this for quite some time that keep doing it. But I think there are many others that don't have the right talent, don't have the right skills, don't have the right understanding, and don't have the right leadership that keeps prioritizing. And I think this is also very important to address the challenge of data quality, because I think quality, which can mean different things for different groups of users, is not necessarily always guaranteed. And without the quality of the data, which is linked also to the interoperability, to the metadata, to the connection with the ecosystem, to understand what quality means for different groups of users, I think if this challenge is not overcome, the use and the reuse of the data will not reach its full potential.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Francesco.
Basically, Barbara has presented all the challenges in a very exhaustive manner. I can add also that basically training population, IT training and digital transformation training is important, because it's important to provide the data, but it's important also to have people that is able to understand this data and is able to do something with this data. So to turn this data into services and products. And also incentives are very important. Barbara mentioned the scientific data. So opening of scientific data, it's something that requires a lot of effort from the side of scientists, and scientists basically are not very keen to do it because the incentives are missing to a certain extent. But an activity, an element that can basically provide an incentive can be citizen science. So citizen science is basically the activity of introducing normal citizens into scientific experiments in order to provide the data to, let's say, regular citizens and to involve citizens in analyzing this data. And in that regard, the citizen science can help scientists basically in reducing the amount of work, especially in repetitive tasks. So this might be an interest and an incentive for scientists from one side, and also for citizens that are interested in this kind of activity. And in this sense, for instance, projects like European Precise Cloud, which is a cloud that is going to share scientific data across the scientific community, it's a very important endeavor. What I can add is, of course, trust. It's a very important topic. So the development of privacy-preserving technologies that are applied to data sharing and data flows, it's a core topic. So we are talking about edge technologies, for instance, that are more, let's say, to a certain extent, more privacy preserving, and also data quality. So we need to provide data, but people have to be sure that the data we provide are of high quality. And mentioning the case of COVID, probably this was the case because a lot of data, open data that was basically reused by, let's say, geeks and scientists, it was basically provided by the public sector. And this was an example of the fact that people reuse this data and they trust in the quality of this data.
Thank you, Francesco. Thanks to all the panel. So now it's time for opening up to all of you for your questions to the panelists, but also I'm keen to hear your views in terms of whether the list of enablers, for example, and capabilities was a list that made sense to you. Please.
Towards opening up of data a lot more, but not all sort of data lend themselves be completely open for several reasons. And health data is obviously one such use case where opening it up poses a lot more risks than, say, keeping it thing. But I'm just wondering if there's any halfway measure between, say, completely open data and siloed closed data that would help open up precisely data sets like health data in ways that can be used truly for public benefit while instituting some sort of purpose limitation in the process, because often with open data sets, purpose limitation becomes a challenge, right? And how are you going to be able to enforce it? Yes, regulation and has a role to play in this, and frameworks need to embed purpose limitations as a part of it. But is there any intermediary mechanism where government agencies or whoever it is that is releasing data can vet the people who want to release this data? Is there any scope for such a mechanism?
Thank you. Let me collect a few more questions.
Hi, I'm Prasanna from the UN Foundation. First of all, my thanks to the panel for a really comprehensive presentation on issues around data sharing. I actually wanted to ask about practical tools that you used for community engagement. You talked a lot about citizen science involving people in collecting data. I wonder if people truly understand what sharing data means. So when they're collecting data on your behalf, do they understand the benefits they'll gain out of it? How benefits flow back to them, if any? If there are any commercial implications, even as citizen scientists, when they provide data, what kind of business models may or may not have been put in place. And also on the other hand, as you build services, we heard a lot about explainability, but I wanted to understand that concept in practical terms. So what do you explain? How? To what level of detail to different audiences? And do people understand if explanations don't make sense to them, what kind of redress or further avenues information available to them? So essentially curious to hear about all sort of practical engagement tools on both the data collection side and data use side.
Thank you. Let me see if there is any other hands up. Yes. And then we go back to our panelists.
Thank you. I think I heard a lot about the pillars on which we are working, which is access to the data, the legal framework. We also work, like, I think there's a lot of work that has been done on the technical side of things. But I think Barbara mentioned something important, which is the cultural change. And I just wanted to ask you about the human dimension. And we speak a lot about data science and skills and data literacy. I feel like my feeling is that that pillar has been a bit like, let's say we have invested a bit less on that pillar so far, but I wonder if this is the reason why use is not so prominent as we were hoping to. So yeah, if there's anything more that we can do on skills, and if there's really like something to do not only on skills in terms of data stewards who are invested in making data available, but much more about policymakers using the data, and which skills do we need to provide to the policymakers for them to be able to leverage the power of data.
Hi, thank you. In talking about data, trustworthy data sharing, are there any capabilities, data sharing frameworks, are there any capabilities gaps you have noticed amongst, or you have observed amongst public sector agencies, for instance, local authorities or local governments that you have worked with, and how can these gaps be addressed?
Thank you for these questions. So we will now go back to our panels. First, perhaps, John, I hope you were able to hear the questions and comments from the floor. John?
Yeah, thanks very much. Great questions. I can talk to two of those. So sort of very quickly. An intermediary between open and siloed data is federation of models. I think that's becoming quite widespread. I'm not talking about federated machine learning for those of you who are into the details. I mean, it is a form of federated machine learning, but it's where you have a silo and you have another silo, which could be relatively large. It could be centralized. It could be a smart city model, a digital twin of air quality and health or whatever. There are all kinds of examples, and you federate that with another cities model or some other system that allows you to couple things without openly sharing the data. You still have to do privacy analytics on it, but that is certainly an approach that we think is quite good. We're about to produce a Royal Society second report on privacy enhancing technologies in January now, I think it's coming out, which has a list of use cases of different privacy enhancing technologies. It's a purely technical thing, but the use cases address these sorts of questions. That doesn't get rid of all the considerations of law, policy, and ethics and so on. It just says, okay, but this is what the tech can do. There are gaps in the technologies. Certainly in performance, you add overheads typically with most of these techniques, and also that they don't prevent somebody just doing the wrong thing. So you still need care about role-based access control and a whole bunch of other things which are important. Of course, if you have data you can share, then you have to go back to all the other things about understanding what it means. And then the penultimate question concerns, what do we need to do about the public understanding? I think there's like, what about skills amongst the general public? I think is close to my heart as an educator, and we do a lot of outreach trying to explain things. I'm not sure how successful we are. It's a long, long way to go. What I would point out is that two things in mostly recent years have led to better public understanding, which was the pandemic and climate and environment. And so a large fraction of the public have become engaged, partly by having to be, but in climate because they get interested from when they're kids. And interestingly, journalists have been helpful where in the past they've been obstructive by not typically reporting the science. In the last 2 or 3 years, we see a massive improvement in the science journalism and general journalism using scientific understanding, but also being good explainers, and perhaps better than people who are overqualified in a particular domain. They are the experts in public communication. So it's been quite a positive thing, I think, and we should figure out why that's working and use it for other sectors where we're doing things with open data of high value.
Thanks, John. So go to Barbara now.
Thank you, Emanuele. I'll try to bundle some of the questions. So I think the 2 questions here have to see with the human, the person, the skills, and the communication. Meaning, yes, I agree. And I think that the whole understanding of the skills needed, the policymakers' understanding of the relevance of data to be used to design better policies, but also the idea of having, for instance, job profiles inside of the public sector. They make sure that people who are entering the public sector, either linked to the open data work or the data core work, have a space, have a role to play. They are not just, they don't feel they're UFOs in the context, in the institution to which they enter. And this requires, as I said, not only having the understanding of the skills you need, but also creating the job profiles that remain in the long run, and the understanding from the top that that job profile is necessary to run the business, be in the public sector, the way it needs to be run in the current era. So I think it's a very complex issue, because it's not just about bringing on board the skills, data scientists, but it's really including it in this idea of what does it mean, modernizing the public sector, transforming, or whatever we want to call it. That's what. So yes, the human, when it comes to the people who are supposed to use the data or open up the data in the public sector, the human intended, who's the recipient of this? I go back to the example of the pandemic. During the pandemic, I think good use of open data, and therefore good availability of public sector data as open data, existed because at some point, the authorities started asking, what do the people need? They need to know where they can find masks. They need to know where the virus is spreading more rapidly in their country. They need to know if they can travel or not. So it was one of the few cases in which the human, being the need of the recipient, was put at the center of these efforts of opening up data and reusing data. And here I come to I'm trying to be brief to give time to my colleague. The communication side. I really think, that at the end of the day, as part of the broader strategies, the communication element cannot be underestimated. Communication internally, because it's not because you have a group of people who are leading the work on open data that automatically all civil servants across the public sector understand it, know it, and embrace, the work. Open data or data, it doesn't, in this sense, it doesn't make a difference. So the communication side internally is essential, but also outside. Meaning, how do we make sure that people who are not the techie, who are not in this room, actually understand what is open data, the value that comes to them. So the communication part, which needs to be defined according to the specific purpose, is essential, cannot be underestimated as a key element of the strategies. And to come to your question on for instance, different levels of maturity across the administration, it can be the local government, or it can be, parts of the administration that are not as used as statistical offices to deal with data. I think it's essential as part of the data strategy for a government, which in many cases is needed, to understand how you can help those who are less mature come into the picture. For instance, standards. Often we think about standards only from a technical point of view. Standards can also help the administration understand what we're talking about, the type of data that need to be opened up, the quality, what does it mean, quality, the concept of metadata. So I really think that local governments in many cases can be more advanced or less advanced. You have big cities or actually as advanced as national administrations in other countries, but there needs to be a specific focus on making sure that the different parts are around the table. Again, going back also to having a single strategy, but also efforts to build the culture, the skills, the capacities that are not necessarily there for granted.
Thank you, Francesco.
Yes, so connecting to your question, we can basically talk about the example of Milan, the city of Milan, in which there has been a huge cultural change over the years. In fact, if we talk about maybe 10 years ago, there were a lot of databases and there were a lot of agencies, offices that basically held their data because the data was a little bit their power. But then there was a mix of political will and technical prowess on the part of certain members of the administration, like Roberta Cocco, who was the vice mayor. And basically, they were able to change the culture in the different offices and to, push people in basically sharing all the data. And now all those data are basically in one single database that is used for public services. And in that regard, it's been also functional, the establishment of the Italian digital team, which is a kind of a task force that works with public administrations and helps public administrations in opening data, in making those data interoperable, and in digitally transforming all the process of public service creation. So it's a mixture of culture, political will, cultural change, political will, and technical prowess that has to be pushed. And on the other hand, talking about citizen science, this is, the core topic is empowerment in this case. We ran a project that has finished at the end of November. The project was called Rainforce, and basically, we were able to involve thousands of citizens in our citizen science experiments because we explained to them that basically what they were doing, it's something very important. And they also had open access, let's say, to the data from big scientific infrastructures. And they also had a physical access to the infrastructures. They were able to see all the technologies that were producing the data. So it was very interesting for them, and they were a lot involved. In the specific case, it's this project that was run by EGO, which is the Observatory of Gravitational Waves, that basically wants to detect the gravitational waves that come from explosions of supernova or basically formation of black holes. And in this sense, we were able to involve a lot of people in this kind of experiments, which consisted in going through, gravitational waves come every 2, 5, 6 years. So there is a lot of data and there is not much to find in this data. So a lot of people, thousands of people was engaged in finding and looking for these abnormalities that turned out to be gravitational waves. So we explained to them that it's important. You're empowered because you are explaining that what you are doing, it's important for science, it's important for society. And we were also able to make it fun to a certain extent, the much is possible. And what is interesting in the sense that we also tried to, we also involved, let's say, groups that are normally not involved in this kind of activities. For instance, through sonification of data, we were able to involve people with visual impairments. So this is also another side of the empowerment that is important, for citizens.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. Thanks, everyone. We are coming now to the end of this session. We learned that there is a complexity in the challenge to use the data for policy purposes, but it's a good complexity. It needs to be harnessed, which means that there would need to be a purpose, first of all, why we are doing this thing, and it should be clearly defined. And that calls for a strategic approach that governments would need to put in place to tackle the different dimensions that have been highlighted by the panelists. With that, I would like to thank Jon, Barbara, and Francesco, and you all for your contribution. We continue in this room. We will have a session on big data for public value creation. And in the red room, there's a special track workshop on citizens-generated data, exactly one of the points that were mentioned by Francesco now. So good luck.